My name is Gary Wan. I'm the membership director for the Tsinkshin Association of Hawaii, and I want to welcome you to the first of a two-part webinar series of the 19th century Chinese who migrated from China to America. Today, we're going to be looking at Hawaii, and next week on the 21st, we're going to look at California. Before I introduce our esteemed guest speaker, I want to just mention a few things. I want to invite you to use the chat function if you have any questions. Anytime during the presentation, write in your questions in the chat, and then we have some people that are looking at that, and they're going to send it over to us when we have our Q&A. So just stick around for that right after the presentation. Also, as I mentioned before, this week and next week's programs are going to be recorded actually. So in case you miss a part or you miss the entire event, like some people that have tried to sign on, because you're registered, you're going to be receiving an email from us to tell you when and where to access them. All right, well, with that said, it's a pleasure to introduce our honored speaker today. He's spent almost 50 years in archaeological and historical research and has written over 200 books and articles. And not only that, he's a member of the Tsinkshin Association of Hawaii. And although, let me just tell you, although he doesn't look Chinese, I'm sure he was probably in a former lifetime. So let me help me welcome Dr. Brian Dillon.
Thank you enough for all the support you're doing.
Thank you. So again, many thanks to Gary from Tsinkshin in Honolulu, and many thanks to Gail and Jeannie in the Bay Area. I'm very happy to be here, and today's talk incorporates 54 slides. It goes for exactly 45 minutes. Since we're getting about a 15-minute late start because of electronic mess ups, I'll be done right about 3. The first third of the talk is introductory material that applies both to California and Hawaii. And then the final 2/3 of today's talk is all about Hawaii. Next week is all about California, but I will be constantly comparing the two areas with each other. Okay, by means of self-introduction, I am not Chinese. I don't speak any Chinese language, but I began researching Chinese American history more than 40 years ago. I married into a Hawaiian Hakka family, and I became the ad hoc historian for that family. I'm an archaeologist. I've worked in 5 different New World countries. I've worked on 5 of the Hawaiian Islands and in 46 of California's 58 counties. As Gary said, I've published a lot of things. I got my PhD at UC Berkeley 42 years ago. Yikes. And I taught archaeology and history for 30 years at many different institutions. Both my father and my son are historians. So history has been the family business for about a century. Okay, what is Chinese American history? It's kind of like the old joke about the 6 blind men and the elephant. It's different things to different people. So you can specialize in one aspect like genealogy, but you certainly cannot afford to ignore the others. And unfortunately, most people who know anything at all about Chinese Hawaiian history often don't know very much about Chinese California history and vice versa. So I seem to be in the middle because I have exposure to both areas and I have connections with both areas. Okay, a little bit on geography. The vast majority of the 19th century Chinese who came both to California and to Hawaii were from a single province. And this, of course, was called Guangdong by English speakers and now is called Guangdong by Mandarin speakers. And traditionally, for hundreds of years, it was the most troublesome of all Chinese provinces. Now, most of the earliest Chinese immigrants to California were Cantonese or Punti from Western Guangdong, and that's indicated by the number 1 on the map. On the other hand, those who went to Hawaii were mostly Hakka, from the eastern part of that same province. Now note how close South China is to the Philippines. There it is, number 3, and how far it is from Peking. It's 3 times farther to Peking than it is to its nearest neighbor across the South China Sea, the Philippines. Okay, a little bit about Hakka culture. Around 900 years ago, a very large group of Chinese people migrated south, and they invaded the lands of the Cantonese. Now, these newcomers became the farmers, the warriors, the bandits, and the rebels of South China. They were less sophisticated than the urban Cantonese. And here's a picture of Tulo. These are multi-story rammed earth defensive houses. And these are neither missile silos nor nuclear reactors, but these were set up as a means of defense against their nasty neighbors by the Hakka around 300 years ago. Okay, a little bit of comparison between the Hakka and the Cantonese. Now, most white Americans are completely unaware of the fact that 2 completely different Chinese ethnic groups came to America. They spoke different languages, they had very different histories, and they were fundamentally dissimilar in many ways. The Cantonese called the people who invaded their territory from the north the Hakka, or the guest people, while the Hakka called those people living around the city of Canton the Punti, which word is now expressed as Bendi by Mandarin speakers. So let's take a look at some of the fundamental differences between the Hakka and the Cantonese. 2 completely different mythical points of origin. John, will you check to make sure it's playing on your computer? Okay, for the Hakka, they believe they came from central China, whereas the Cantonese say they've always been in South China. Settlement patterns were very different. The Hakka were very rural people. They were all farmers. And many of the Cantonese were urban. And if not urban, then they were suburban. They were city dwellers. Literacy was rare amongst the Hakka, but very common amongst the Punti, or the Cantonese. After all, they were city folks. There were lots of schools in the city. The status of women between the 2 groups was very, very different. The Hakka like to say that the women were equal to the men, at least the women say that. They had no foot binding, and in fact, the Punti used to call the Hakka the Bigfoot woman group. And amongst the Punti, there was great sexual inequality. They tended to bind the feet of the women, and women had much lower status amongst the Punti than they had amongst the Hakka. In terms of military skills, the Hakka were good soldiers. They were really good soldiers, and when they weren't being soldiers, they were really good bandits too. The Cantonese, like a lot of city people everywhere, were very poor soldiers, and the Hakka even had female generals. Okay, business and banking skills. The Hakka, again, hey, they're farmers, so they weren't terribly good businessmen. On the other hand, the Cantonese were superlative business people, bankers, money lenders, all that kind of stuff. Opium use. Well, the Hakka, being boondocks people, farmers, very, very little opium use amongst them, both in China and then overseas. Whereas the Cantonese, being city people, very heavy addiction amongst the Cantonese when it came to opium. And they took it with them overseas as well. Okay, in terms of the modern day population, believe it or not, there may be as many as twice as many Hakka around the world as Cantonese, perhaps 120 million Hakka around the world. And some parts of the world are very, very heavily Hakka. Singapore, for example, is mostly Hakka. Hawaii was originally Hakka. Cantonese, very strong in California, strong in northern Mexico, and so forth and so on. Okay, some world famous Hakka. Okay, probably the best known, Sun Yat-sen. He was the Hakka father of modern China. He was born in Guangdong. He was educated in Hawaii and in Hong Kong, and he spoke Hakka, Punti, Mandarin, Hawaiian, and English. He always considered himself to be a second generation Taiping rebel. And from his secure base in Hawaii, he enlisted the overseas Chinese and finally was able to topple the Manchus and founded the Republic of China in 1911. And of course, Sun Sen had a big role to play in that. Then, much more recently, another very famous Hakka was Deng Xiaoping, who brought China out of its Maoist dark ages, and he made it okay to be Hakka in modern China. He also kind of opened the door for the overseas Chinese and let them back in. Okay, so now let's look at Chinese American history between Hawaii and California. Completely different, two completely different paths here. And it's really important to note that generalizations about one area absolutely, positively do not apply to the other area. Okay, so Hawaii, the Chinese came first. They came much earlier than they did to California. And how many came? Well, that again is very different. Only a tenth as many Chinese went to Hawaii as eventually went to California. But how many stayed is another different story. About 90% of all the Chinese that went to Hawaii stayed there. It was paradise. I mean, most of them were leaving, they were running away from China with a price on their head because the Manchus were after them and they could never go back to China. So they went to Hawaii to create a whole new life in paradise. On the other hand, only a tiny fraction of all the Chinese that went to California stayed there, only about a quarter of them. Most of them either went back to China or made certain that their bones were sent back to China once they were dead. Okay, who came? About 90% Hakka went to Hawaii, only 10% Punti early on. And it was exactly the reverse in California. About 90% Punti or Cantonese, and only about 10% Hakka went to California. Why did they come? The motivation was very different. 90% of all the people that went to Hawaii went there for sanctuary. Again, if you couldn't get out of China, you were a dead man. And that's different in California, where 90% of the people that went there to get rich quick. How many brought wives? Well, about a quarter of all the people that went to Hawaii either brought their wives with them or sent for wives. And in fact, you had lots and lots of Hawaiian Hakka Chinese females working in the cane fields alongside the men. Very, very different in California. Very few of the Cantonese that went to California brought their wives with them, and it was much more difficult to get women into California. So only about 5% of all the Punti that went to California actually had their wives there too. How many married non-Chinese? Well, this was very common in Hawaii. The first wave of Hakka men, mostly cane cutters, tended to marry into Hawaiian families. About a quarter of all the Hakka that went to Hawaii married native Hawaiians. Very uncommon in California, down around 5%. And most of the people that married non-Chinese, the Chinese folks, married Mexicans. Okay, buried locally. Once again, in Hawaii, about 90% of the people there buried locally. You go anywhere around Honolulu and it's just covered with Hakka cemeteries. I mean, I met my mother-in-law and we visited 8 cemeteries the first day, and she introduced me to all the dead relatives. It took all day, as opposed to California, where most of the Cantonese had their bones sent back to China if they were so unfortunate as to die in California. But most importantly, the host societies was completely different between the two areas. In Hawaii, the host society was friendly, and in California, it was hostile. Okay, so let's look a little bit about what anthropologists like me take for granted every day, but what historians very seldom consider. And this involves race, ethnicity, culture, and nationality. These things are completely different, and yet too many people, mostly white historians, think they're all the same. Anyway, at left is a photo of my late mother-in-law, and here she is in Honolulu in 1934 at age 13. So let's look at these 4 categories in the context of just one person. Race is biology. nothing more, nothing less. And Aoi, my mother-in-law, is 100% Asian. Okay, ethnicity is different. It's where your ancestors were from. Aoi is 100% Chinese, but she's also 50% Hakka through her dad and 50% Punti through her mom. Culture is defined by what language you speak and how you identify yourself. So Aoi identifies herself as Asian Hawaiian and Asian American. She speaks Pidgin, but she never learned to speak Hakka nor Hawaiian. Like her father, her dad spoke Hakka and Hawaiian, but he never spoke English. And then finally, nationality is what country you're a citizen of. Aoi is an American. She was born in the territory of Hawaii, but her parents and grandparents were citizens of the Hawaiian kingdom. Okay, another thing that really throws most white historians is that they don't understand anything at all about Chinese language and writing. Saying that somebody speaks Chinese is only as accurate as saying that somebody speaks European. There are more than 80 different languages in China, and these are languages, they're not dialects. Europeans mislabel completely different languages as dialects because there is only one universal Chinese writing system, not a separate one for each different language, as is the case in Europe. And of course, the three most relevant languages for Chinese American history are two from South China, Cantonese for California and Hakka for Hawaii. And then since 1949, the communists have tried to make the old North Chinese imperial language, Mandarin, the sole language of government, business, and international commerce. So those three are the most important languages for Chinese American history. But to make a point, here on the left is a great photograph from about 1900, and two completely different ethnic groups are reading the newspaper wall at the same time. Two different people speaking two completely different languages can still read the same stuff. The Punti are the guys with the long braids. Obviously, they're still wearing them to honor the emperor. Imperial decree required for 250 years that you had to wear a queue as a symbol of your loyalty to the emperor. The two guys with short hair are Hakka. Hey, no emperor for us, guys. And everybody can read the same thing, okay? Despite speaking two completely different languages, all four can read the Chinese writing because it's ideographic. It's not phonetic. And that's unlike every European writing system. Okay, a little bit on my own family connection with China. There's my great-great-grandfather, the arrow on the top left. He was a China trader in Canton in the 1850s. Moving on, my great-great-granduncle, fighting Bob Evans. He was a Civil War hero, and he visited China as a naval officer in the 1870s. Then, in 1898, he was sent by President McKinley to the just annexed Hawaiian Islands on a fact-finding mission. And Evans reported back to the president that all of the native Hawaiian women that he interviewed wanted to be married to Chinese men because they all said they made the best husbands. Hallelujah. Okay, moving on. Here's my grandfather. Again, the arrow in the back. There he is at the San Francisco Presidio. He enlisted in Company A, the 1st California Volunteers. They stopped off in Honolulu in 1898 and moved on to the Philippines. He re-enlisted in 1900 and went to China. And he was in the Boxer Rebellion. That's him down below, blowing down the gates of the Forbidden City in Peking in 1900. And his commanding officer, another good Irishman, was the last American killed in the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, my dad, moving up through the generations, my father was a very famous California historian, and he wrote about the California Chinese all his life. And here's some of the books he wrote over a 60, 70-year period. And that brings us to me. So here's me at age 8 in Honolulu. I'm the handsome one in the middle with my pet myna bird, and my best friend in Hawaii was a Chinese kid. Okay, 2 years later, at age 10, I became a firecracker smuggler, sneaking over into San Francisco Chinatown over the bridge, and then bringing illegal fireworks back and selling them on the school ground. And then that brings us to the present tense. Okay, so here we are, my Hawaiian-born Chinese wife and me inside the Great Hall of the People on Tiananmen Square in Peking about 7 years ago. Having firecrackers at our wedding was a really good idea, and it certainly paid off because we've been together now for 46 years. Okay, I've written a bunch of things about Chinese American history, mostly short articles, but right now I'm working on a major biography of my wife's aunt, Alice Chong, and we'll hear more about her later today. Okay, a little bit on genealogy, since so many of the folks logged in are genealogists. Everybody knows the old joke that what they study is the greatest interest to their own family, but exceedingly boring to any other family. But the Chinese are, and probably always have been, the world's most dedicated and accomplished genealogists. Most white Americans have trouble tracing their ancestry back beyond 3 generations, while many Chinese know the birth and death dates of ancestors who lived 400 years ago. So start your genealogical research in the library, but don't stay in the library. Now go out and interview all of the elderly members of your own family, building up your family history one bit at a time. Find out where all of your ancestors lived and when. Now go to every cemetery you think might contain family members and copy down the information on the headstones. Then interview the grave diggers, the headstone carvers, and the folks that take care of the cemetery, because they're the folks that really know what's going on. And now go to every last place your ancestors may have lived at and interview all of the descendants of your old neighbors who might still be living there. You never know what they will be able to tell you about your family. Okay, a little bit on some of the basic literature for Chinese Hawaiian history. There's a lot of things that have been published. If you're interested in it, start buying these books and start compiling your own library. There's a lot of very specialized things too, like the limited circulation study in the middle, island by island. Sources for Chinese Hawaiian history, government documents. These were required by anti-Chinese politicians and bureaucrats after 1898, when anti-Chinese sentiment was exported from the American mainland to Hawaii for the first time. But they can sometimes offer genealogical clues unobtainable from any other source. And on the left is my father-in-law, David Chong's certificate of Hawaiian birth. Everybody had to have one proving that they were not an illegal alien. And then over on the right is my father-in-law's internal passport, which he had to show when he got off the boat in California, once again, proving that he was Hawaiian, not an illegal alien. And you thought that only happened in South Africa. But anyway, the point is we found through all this documentation the actual birth date of my grandfather-in-law, which we didn't know before, and it was 1847. So they can sometimes be useful. Other sources of information for genealogy and family history, personal letters. Here are more than 300 letters sent by just one of my Chinese relatives to just one of her friends, a pen pal, over a 48-year period. And there are many, many things like this up in the attic. You just have to look for them. Okay, other sources of information, newspaper articles. Here's Alice Chong again, my hero, and one of many, many newspaper articles she wrote and had published in the Honolulu Star Bulletin. There's one from 1938 over there on the left. And then she was a star in various newspaper articles herself. There she is in 1943 over on the right. Okay, other sources of family history information, very, very useful if you got them. Family photos. Back to Alice Chong, here's her 3 different photo albums going back as far as the 20s in Honolulu and the outer islands, Kauai, and then in China as early as 1933. And she has inscriptions for some of the photographs in both Chinese and English. Once again, start looking up in the attic in the old trunks and in the shoe boxes to see if you can't find similar things. Okay, graveyards, hit the graveyards. Anybody who's done Chinese genealogical research in Hawaii spends an awful lot of time in cemeteries. And we take for granted a situation that very few mainland white historians are even aware of, that the same person may have been known by three completely different names during his lifetime. He could be known by his Chinese birth name, by his Hawaiian nickname, and by his English work or school name. And here's a good example of that: three different languages for one guy. Okay, oral history interviewing is by far the least, shall we say, appreciated amongst historians. And it's, on the other hand, it's what we archaeologists and anthropologists, we do this every day. Anyway, somebody out there probably knows everything about your subject, and that person has been waiting for years just to tell somebody about it. The trick is finding that person and getting them to trust you enough to talk to you. For Chinese family history and genealogical research, the best informant is always grandma. And I've done oral history interviewing in 5 different countries, including both California and Hawaii in the USA. But you have to remember, almost none of your elderly informants will have computers. Almost none of them will have email. Almost none of them will have cell phones. And to talk to some of them, you may need an interpreter. So make it easy for them to tell you their story. Don't make it hard for them. Sit down, ask them questions, and then just let them talk. Ask if you can tape record or videotape them. They may say no at first, and then yes after they've learned to come and trust you. Okay, there are pitfalls for the unwary, though, in this kind of research. There's a lot of fake documents out there and a lot of false names. And this is particularly true amongst Chinese American history, where you had a hostile government and a lot of people are trying to work their way around the government. On the left and in the middle are 2 fake documents ginned up by Sun Yat-sen, falsely stating or claiming that he was Hawaiian born. And this was to keep him from getting murdered by the Manchu hit squads that had already killed 79 of his followers back in South China. Then another point is that this is not only unique to Chinese. That's my grandfather on the right. And he enlisted in the US Army under 3 different fake names over a long period. And he's buried in the San Francisco Presidio Cemetery under a stone with a fake name, a fake birth date, and a fake birthplace. Okay, more historical background. The Opium Wars really start clobbering China in a big way. The British come in, they were pushing opium. Opium was not an old Chinese tradition until the British introduced it. They had a monopoly on opium production in British India, and then they tried to corner the market in China. And when the Chinese authorities objected, the British declared war and stole Hong Kong from China. And then all the other European powers said, oh, what a good idea. And they went in and stole their own ports as well. More historical background. Meanwhile, the Punti Hakka Wars are going on in South China. And these broke out, first of all, in Guangxi province, and then they spread to Guangdong. And Punti Hakka fighting also occurred overseas. There were pitched battles in Malaysia and even in Northern California. And some historians estimate that more than 1 million Punti and Hakka people were killed in this fighting just in the 1860s. Okay, but the big one, the really big one, was the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was 100% Hakka inspired and Hakka led. The Taipings defeated all the Imperial Manchu armies sent against them, and they invaded North China from the south. They established their own capital at Nanking. And they were only defeated when the Manchus solicited foreign armed assistance, mostly British. Now the Hakka rebels had prices on their heads, and many of them fled China to begin a new life in Hawaii as refugees. The death toll during the rebellion and the vicious Manchu retribution immediately afterwards has been estimated by some as high as 30 million people. Okay. Well, the first Chinese came to Hawaii in 1789, but the Great Mahele of 1852 opened up land for sugar cultivation and the need for thousands of cane cutters. So the flood really didn't start until the 1850s. The Hakka were preferred over all others for this miserable job of cutting cane. By 1860, the Chinese, mostly Hakka, were the largest non-Hawaiian group in the islands. Today, however, they're one of the smallest. So the first period of Chinese history in the Hawaiian Islands is the sandalwood period. And the earliest Chinese name for Hawaii was Tongyongshan, the Sandalwood Mountains. Chinese could not get enough sandalwood. They used it for incense, for furniture, and it was kind of an imperial conceit to have all your furniture in the Forbidden City made only of sandalwood. Eventually, King Kamehameha declared a royal monopoly on every sandalwood tree in the Hawaiian Islands. So the earliest Chinese came to Hawaii to stay 40 years before the sugar industry got started and 60 years before the California gold rush. These were mostly sailors who jumped ship to work sandalwood. Most of them, almost all of them, were single males, and most of them took Hawaiian wives. Okay, second period is sugar. Sugar agriculture were ancient South Chinese traditions, a Hakka specialty, and they were passed first to the Philippines in the 16th century and then to Hawaii in the 1830s. And what we're looking at is an 18th century Hakka stone two-roller sugarcane press. And this is not in Hawaii, it's in Guangdong, China, and it's identical to the earliest ones in Hawaii. This is because sugar was created. The whole sugar industry was invented and created by Hakka specialists brought from China, especially to get it started. The very first successful mill in Hawaii was Koloa Plantation on Kauai, and it got going around 1835. Okay, Hawaii welcomes the Chinese. Native Hawaiians from the royal family on down all like the Chinese, and they made them feel welcome. The Chinese threw a banquet for Queen Emma's wedding in 1856, and she was forever grateful to them. 20 years later, King Kalakaua said he wished that Hawaii had 20 million more Chinese. He liked them so much. Of course, this was also a way of thumbing his nose at the whites that were busy taking his country away from him at the time. Okay, here's Chun Afong, Hawaii's first Chinese millionaire. That's him on the left. He was a punti who came to Hawaii from Guangdong. He had 20 kids with his 3 wives, and one of his wives was part white and part Hawaiian. And his most famous son was Tony, there he is on the right, who was one of 16 kids he had with his part Hawaiian wife. Chun became an advisor to King Kalakaua. He introduced the lychee to Hawaii, and he also became the kingpin of the Hawaiian opium trade, so not entirely a good guy. His son Tony, believe it or not, became the governor of Guangdong province in China under Sun Yat-sen. He had 1 wife and 6 concubines. And that brings us to my family. So here's my great-grandmother-in-law, Chin Ying Tai, standing next to her husband, my great-grandfather-in-law, Fung Tet On, whose nickname was Noble Pioneer. The Fungs were first-generation Hakka who came to Kohala, Hawaii to work sugar. He came in 1883, she came in 1891 with their 11-year-old son, Fung Tong Shu, and their 6-year-old adopted daughter, Chok Amoy. The little girl was obtained from a Punti orphanage. She was brought to Hawaii as their oldest son's future wife. And there was a good reason for that, because in 1884, there were over 1,100 Chinese men on the Big Island, but only 90 Chinese women. They're just totally outnumbered. Kohala at the time was still 75% Native Hawaiian, so all the Fungs learned that language. And this photo is cropped because they both were barefoot, too poor to afford shoes, but as we're fond of saying, their life of grinding poverty in Hawaii was preferable to starvation in South China and to systematic humiliation, harassment, and casual murder in intolerant California. Okay, next generation up. Here is my grandfather-in-law, Fung Tong Shu here. Tommy Fung was a Hawaiian-speaking Hakka taro farmer, fisherman, and carpenter. He was taken away from his wife and his 5 children at Kohala and kept in limbo at Kalihi Hospital on Oahu because he was suspected of having leprosy or maipake. Between 1866 and 1969, when the practice finally ceased, more than 8,000 suspected maipake sufferers were exiled to Kalapapa. We don't think he ever had maipake. He blew himself up dynamite fishing on the beach in 1910, blinded one eye, blew off one hand. So he looked very scary, but I never thought that he ever had leprosy. Anyway, as a consequence, his youngest child, my mother-in-law, never knew her own father. Okay, and here we are at Kalapapa, where so many Chinese exiles were sent. Robert Louis Stevenson called it a prison fortified by nature. And here is where Fung Tongshu's grave is. There it is under the white arrow. Most of the Chinese graves at Kalapapa are inside the lava boulder enclosure at left, whereas Hawaiian graves are outside it to the right. And my grandfather-in-law, Tommy Fung, was buried amongst his Hawaiian friends. Okay, 4th generation Fungs. Here's my long-suffering wife, Millie, over on the left. That's Fung Tet On's great-granddaughter, my wife. She's at the Hakka Tong Wo Fraternal Association Building and Cemetery. This is near Kapa'au in Kohala, Hawaii, and it was built in 1886. Her great-grandfather, Fung Tet On, helped raise this building, and then he was the Tong Wo cook inside it. The building has been added to the National Register of Historic Places, and it still exists as a focus of Hakka pride throughout the Hawaiian Islands. Okay, other side of the family, 1st generation Chongs at Lawai on the island of Kauai. Well, Chong Ani, my other grandfather-in-law, was a Taiping rebel fleeing China with a price on his head. He was shipwrecked off Niihau in 1864, and he was taken in by a Hawaiian family. He learned to speak Hawaiian. Then he moved on to Kauai to work as a luna at Koloa Plantation, once again, the earliest successful sugar operation in the Hawaiian Islands. And it's just to the east of this photo. Anyway, Chong became Queen Emma's royal rice farmer around 1869. His rice fields are still visible under the white arrow at left. He had 3 wives. He had 2 Hawaiian wives and 1 Chinese wife. He fathered 33 children here on the south coast of Kauai. Okay, a pattern very, very common throughout the outer islands is that as the Chinese stop or complete their first 5-year hitch of cutting cane, they moved to the city, or they very few of them ever re-upped. They didn't renew a contract for a second 5 years, and that's why the cane growers sent for Japanese and then Portuguese and finally Filipino cane cutters, and because the Chinese just refused to do it a second time. So most of the Chinese eventually over time in the Hawaiian Islands began to migrate to towns and cities. So anyway, many Chinese moved to the big city, Honolulu, and Chinatown, Honolulu was the result. And above we see Chinatown in Honolulu burning on January 20th, 1900. It was set afire as a means of controlling bubonic plague. In San Francisco, the anti-Chinese group always threatened to set Chinatown on fire, but they never did. It actually happened in Hawaii. Okay, rural to urban. Here's the Chong side of the family, 2nd and 3rd generation Chong. So here's the family shortly after moving to Honolulu from Kauai, exactly 100 years ago. My grandfather-in-law, Hawaiian-speaking Hakka Chong Ani, is there at center, and his 3rd Hakka wife, who was 29 years younger than him, and even younger than some of his half Hawaiian children he had with his 2 Hawaiian wives, is sitting over to his right. My favorite uncle, Lawrence Chong, is in the back row wearing the white suit on the right, and he was quadrilingual. He spoke Hakka, Hawaiian, Japanese, and English. And on the outside are the twins. That's Mabel on the left and Alice on the right. Both the twins never spoke a word of English until they were 8 years old, and yet they both graduated from the University of Hawaii in 1933. Of the 6 brothers shown in the photograph, 4 were serving at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Okay, second generation Chongs. Here's Alice Chong, the woman I'm writing the biography of, amazing person. She was the only American-born Chinese woman to both teach at the Jinling Girls College and work for Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers 14th U.S. Army Air Force at Kunming. Okay, so here we have first, second, and third generation Chongs. You can always tell the Hawaiian because she's smothered in leis. Okay, so there's Auntie Alice disembarking from Honolulu on her first trip to China to go teach English in China. She also learned her 5th language on this trip, which was Mandarin. She already spoke Hakka and Punti and Hawaiian and English. Okay, she had been offered a job at the most prestigious women's university in all of Asia, and this was Jinling Girls College in the Chinese capital, Nanking. She boarded ship on August 13th, 1937 for her second trip to China, but her timing was incredibly bad. This was the very same day that the Japanese attacked Shanghai by land, sea, and air. And she took this photograph of a Japanese destroyer herding off her civilian liner, trying to come into Shanghai Harbor. The Japanese absolutely turned them away. And then before too long, 1,000 refugees came out and boarded her ship. It took a detour down to Hong Kong and got away. Okay, so here's Alice again, sitting on the front bumper of the truck, and these are various Jinling girls that were evacuated as refugees from Nanking after the horrific rape of Nanking in 1937. They're in Shanghai now in 1938, and Alice was just amazing. She got the Jinling girls and faculty members out of Japanese-occupied Shanghai and talked her way through roadblock after roadblock, and then by steamer, by riverboat, by truck, by train, on foot, by sedan chair, on horseback. She evacuated them 2,500 miles down to West China and safety in what we called Free China. So she was just an unbelievable hero of the war long before Pearl Harbor. Okay, so here's Jinling in exile at Sichuan. This is Sichuan, eventually became Sichuan University. And a good buddy of mine taught here for many years. 50 years later, we'll meet him next week. But in this photograph, the 1 is on Madam Chiang sitting in the front row, right behind the Jinling flag. And there's Auntie Alice, number 2, standing right behind Madam Chiang. So she was a real involved person in every last aspect of American/Chinese doings during the 30s. Okay, and I'm not the first anthropologist in the family either. When not teaching at Jinling, Alice Chong explored Southwest China. On the right, she's on a horse borrowed from Chiang Kai-shek, and on the right, she's interviewing a guerrilla tribesman up near the Tibetan border. After the war, she came back to the States. She got an MA degree in anthropology from Columbia University, and her thesis was on Hawaiian folklore. Okay, she was friends with every last Chinese pilot in the Chinese Air Force. Not too many people know that the very first World War II ace was Chinese. That's him, Arthur Chin of Portland, Oregon, over there on the right in the photograph. He had 9 kills by 1939. And here's Alice with some of her Flying Tigers buddies on the Kunming airstrip about 1944. That's her with the arrow. Anyway, she was General Claire Chennault's intelligence expert and radio intercept translator. She was General Chennault's secret weapon. Her covered name was Base Librarian. Okay, and we're nearing the end of the slideshow. My more second generation Chongs. Here's my father-in-law, David, with the oars. He was an Olympic class swimmer, completely at home on the water. He was a rigger at Pearl Harbor. And on December 7th, 1941, he went into the water 6 times, pulling drowning sailors ashore and saving at least that many lives. And at top right are his US Navy 5 and 20-year pins, but the award he was most proud of was his 1937 Barefoot Football Championship pin. And there it is over on the right. You really got to be Hawaiian to know about this stuff. Okay, Alice and David were not the only family members to serve with distinction in World War II. At left is Robert Lee, their cousin in his US Marine Corps uniform. I know very little about him, so after I finish the book on Alice, maybe I can spend some research time on Robert. Okay, and as we come to the end of today's talk, I'd like to thank the institutions and organizations that hosted it. First off, the Honolulu Songsin Association was one of many late 19th and early 20th century Hakka secret societies around the world that were dedicated to the overthrow of the Manchus. It supported Sun Yat-sen financially, and it hid his wife and children in Hawaii from Manchu assassins. My grandfather-in-law, Chong Ani, like most Hakka Taiping refugees in Hawaii, was an early supporter of Dr. Sun. Songsin went public after Sun's final 1911 victory over the Manchus and the creation of the Chinese Republic. And I'm very proud to be a member of this historic association, and I may in fact be the only Irish member. Okay, last slide. And we're 1 minute shy of 45 minutes in. Pretty good. Okay, so traditional for any Hawaiian lecture is the obligatory final sunset shot. So we say aloha to the Hawaiian Chinese as we watch the sun go down from Kalapapa, Molokai. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to log on next week for part 2 of this series when we move across the Pacific to visit the California Chinese. And now we're going to go back to Gary, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay.
Before we go to the Q&A, I just want to take a couple of minutes to share with you folks some valuable and important resources for you. As Brian was mentioning about Sungshin, they are part of the Worldwide Hakka Association and have been in Hawaii since the early 1900s. Having been in Hawaii for so long, our membership book, our old membership book, actually lists 144 Hakka surnames, some as early as 1913.
Wow.
And it's a valuable resource to anyone starting their search. They also have many social and educational events that happen throughout the year. Or actually, should I say, that happened during a non-COVID year. Anyway, one of our community partners, the Bay Area Chinese Genealogy Group, focuses on helping people learn about how to unlock their past through webinars and other fascinating programs, such as the one they did on the Chinese nightclubs in the Bay Area, which is actually very close to my heart because my mother was a showgirl during the late 1940s in San Francisco. And recently they did one on the World War II Chinese American GIs who were recently recognized by Congress for their valor and their sacrifice. Our other community partner is the Chinese Family History Group of Southern California. Similar to BACGG, they help support their members in their search for the past. Among many of their programs and webinars was one about helping you find your family stories, and another about finding information about your family through stories about food and tradition, with their most recent guest, Chef Martin Yan. You know, you never know where you're going to discover clues, but stories such as these, and as well as all these educational webinars, help us to have a better appreciation for information that's slowly becoming more distant. And finally, 2 others to help you explore your family's history. The Hawaii Chinese History Center here in Honolulu, Hawaii, with Douglas Chong, He's the preeminent expert and historian who spent almost all of his life helping to preserve Chinese history here in Hawaii. The History Center is in its 44th year of helping people research, write, and publish their own personal stories. And finally, the Friends of Roots organization who helped me find my roots in China. For the past 31 years, they've helped Chinese American students and adults learn about their cultural heritage and help them locate their ancestral villages. But more importantly, I think than that, they don't just help you find where you're from, but I think they answer the more burning question for many of us. And that is, what does it actually mean to be Chinese? One thing's for certain, while I walked through the narrow pathways of my grandparents' villages, it really saddened me that many of these old people that helped us out there and who knew where to go, knew all the type of people that lived there and which houses they lived in, they're all disappearing. So my message to you is don't leave this search for your roots to your children.
Yeah.
Think of doing so. I think doing so is going to be a big mistake.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
The better thing to do is to get them engaged and make sure this is a fun family project. They'll probably ultimately thank you for doing so. All of these organizations I just mentioned provide valuable resources and knowledge, and I urge you to visit their websites, become a member, or become a supporter and explore what they have to offer. All of these links will be displayed at the end of this presentation, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything. So with that, let's go ahead and bring back Dr. Dillon for our Q&A. Brian? So I have a question, Brian, from Joseph Yoshino.
Okay.
And he asks, can you tell us about your wife's Aunt Alice Chong, General Chenault's secret weapon and the flying tigers?
Again, I'm writing a full-length book on it, and I've already published one short article on this. If you want to send the email to you, Gary, and then pass it on to me, I can send him the short article and give him a little more information. But she wanted to do more for the war effort. She actually, most people know that, of course, Chenault was stationed in Honolulu. He loved the Chinese. He got along fine with them so much that he married a Chinese woman. He was the highest ranking American soldier with a Chinese wife in World War II. And then when Alice went to China the first time in 1933, she got to know all of the Chinese military folks. She actually taught Chenault and Jimmy Doolittle enough conversational Chinese to get along, and she stayed friends with them. She knew every last pilot in the Chinese Air Force. She was friends with all of them. And then she kept teaching at Jinling until 1943, when she figured she really had to do more for the war effort. And then she left Jinling and went to Kunming and was Chenault's full-time intelligence expert and translator. She was not the only one. There was one other missionary lady, a white woman, and between the two of them, they were on duty 24 hours a day, doing radio intercepts and translating Japanese messages, Chinese stay-behind messages, things like that. And so without her, the 14th Air Force would not have been very successful at all. She gave them all the targeting information that made them hit the enemy where they were, not where they weren't. So that's kind of the short version, but I've published a little bit already. I'd be more than happy to send a copy of it out.
Okay, very nice.
Uh-huh.
Next question, can you tell us how to research sugar plantation records?
Yeah, you got to go to Hawaii and you got to go knock on the door of various people. Most of the records are now, if they have been preserved, they're either in Honolulu or in the Bishop Museum. Okay, the Bishop Museum has lots and lots of records from individual plantations. And then there's all kinds of other sources of information. Believe it or not, the Mission House Museum and Archive in Honolulu, where all those evangelists, those white Protestant Bible thumpers, they have lots and lots of records of this stuff, because let's face it, who were the people that owned the land? They were the sons and the grandsons of the original missionaries. And in fact, they were taking notes from their confreres in both in California and missionaries in China. And that's why they selected the Hakka as the best possible cane cutters, because missionaries were sending notes to other missionaries and saying, well, who are the most hardworking people, least likely to have unionized or union problems, things like that. And so back and forth and back and forth. The Bishop Museum is a wealth of information, all kinds of archival stuff. The Hawaii State Archives is another place to go. Unfortunately, a lot of the companies that are still descended from the original sugar concerns don't have anything organized or indexed. They'd probably let you in to see them, but you'd have to wade through box after box after box of records to find what you're looking for. But it would be a fertile field for additional information. Sure.
Okay, nice.
Sure.
Let's see. Says here, I assume immigration rules of the Kingdom of Hawaii saw Hakka as refugees / laborers, whereas U.S. saw them as laborers, thus not allowing women due to the Chinese exclusion law. Can you discuss Hawaiian immigration and foreign affairs as compared to the U.S. in the same period?
Sure. What most people forget is that when the bulk of the Chinese went to Hawaii, it was the Kingdom of Hawaii. It wasn't American. There was no American government control. And so basically, if the king said, come on in, you came on in, and there was no problem with it. Okay. And so what most mainland Americans don't know is that this continued uninterrupted until 1893. In 1893, of course, the white planters overthrew, the Hawaiian monarchy and established the short-lived Hawaiian Republic. And then they started to tighten things up a little bit. But they really did not prohibit the entry of Chinese or Chinese women or Chinese kids or anything. They didn't. That didn't come until 1898, when we went as the US of A and we annexed Hawaii, and it became suddenly a territory of the US of A. And all of the repressive anti-Chinese legislation did not exist in Hawaii at all until 1898. Point in fact, the Chongs on Kauai, the dad had only met one white guy in his entire life, and that was the white man that bought out Lawai Valley from Queen Emma. Okay, and they communicated in the only language they had in common, which was Hawaiian. Okay, and all the Chong kids were born at home. There were no birth records. There was nothing like that. They saw their first white woman in 1914 when two school marms climbed down into the valley and were surprised at this giant flock of kids that weren't going to school, And so all of a sudden, the boom gets lowered, and prove who you are and prove where you were born. And so they were living under the radar until 1914. And this, of course, is 16 years after the American takeover. And this is not a unique story. But once the Americans established control, they exported all the nasty racist laws from the mainland to Hawaii. And we'll talk more about that next week in the context of what's going on the mainland. And as I'm fond of saying, one of my elderly Hawaiian Chinese relatives said, thank God my ancestors stepped off the boat in Hawaii, not in California. And it's kind of true, so.
Okay, let's see. How do we find information about rice farmer workers in Kauai by Hanalei?
Hanalei, on the opposite, complete other side of the island, there were many, many more of them than on the south end. The south end, this is Lawai Valley. Today, it is the Pacific Botanical Tropical Garden. You can go visit it and see where Chong had his little empire. But he was a one-man band. He had 33 kids. The whole family worked the rice there. There were no outsiders doing it. Hanalei Bay on the north end, you had a whole bunch of different families, and it was a much more, should we say, open kind of deal. At first, on at Lawai, where the Chong, my Chong relatives were, that was literally Queen Emma's monopoly. And she basically sold the rice to various plantations everywhere as food for the plantation workers, both Chinese and, of course, Native Hawaiian. Hanalei was very different. You had a whole bunch of different families working it. The best source of information would be the Kauai Historical Society, and they're really nice folks. I've worked with them a bunch, and they're really happy to help. And they will have lots and lots of records, lots of family names, and so forth and so on. The other interesting aspect of it, it wasn't 100% Chinese. There were a lot of Hawaiians involved in it too. So, and again, not just the wives of the Hawaiian guys working the rice, but other Native Hawaiians as well. So two opposite ends of the island, rice was a big crop grown on Kauai for a lot of years.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question here. It says here, Hakka is a dialect and the food is different from Cantonese. My family speaks Namlong. What is the difference?
Hakka is not a dialect, it's a language. And again, I've been correcting this misnomer for many years. Like I say, there are around 80 different languages spoken in China. And unfortunately, when the white missionaries went to China, they said, oh, gee, they all have the same writing system. Therefore, these can't be different languages. They must be dialects. So the word dialect is wrong and has been wrong and was applied in China as early as the 1830s by missionaries who couldn't be bothered to learn more than one Chinese language. You see what I'm getting at? And so again, I really don't like the term dialect. Dialect is just a different kind of one language. So like Ebonics is an English dialect. Oklahoma drawl is an English dialect. Cockney is an English dialect. But you can't call Hakka a dialect of Chinese unless you believe that English is a dialect of German. You see what I'm getting at? Okay, so that's my long answer to this question. Every tour guide you'll meet in China will tell every group there are many dialects. Why? Because that was the English word they were taught in the communist-sponsored tourist school. You see, and so it's an incorrect word. If you study anthropology like I do, then you realize, hey, don't use that word. Use the correct word. It's a language. It's a completely unique language that's unintelligible to other speakers of different languages, like Wu, Shanghai. Millions and millions of people speak Shanghainese or Wu. Okay, then they don't understand Cantonese, they don't understand Hakka, they don't understand Mandarin, so forth and so on. So again, there is no single language in China, even though the modern day communists have tried to make everybody learn Mandarin, which is kind of a joke because that's the old evil Manchu court language. You know, that was the language the people they wanted out spoke. So again, it's kind of hard to comprehend unless you really understand the fact that China is made up of many different groups with many different histories, many different languages, living in many different areas. It's just like Chinese dynastic history. It's not one group knocking over their neighbor. It's a group that established itself in one part of China, then conquering big areas away from their homeland. And then a couple hundred years later, they get knocked off by a different group from somewhere else, also expanding into other areas they weren't before. You know, you tell people that the capital of China in 1937, it wasn't Peking, it was Nanking. Okay, why? Because Sun Yat-sen wanted to reestablish the new capital of China in the old Taiping rebel capital from the 1860s, and he did. And so that's why when the Japanese just slaughtered so many people in Nanking, they were doing it not as a whim, but because that was the Chinese capital, and they were going to show everybody that they were the boss. You know. So anyway, a kind of a long dissembling answer to a simple question, but again, Hakka is not a dialect. It's not a dialect. Okay.
So in a sense, they're not a dialect, but they are different than the Cantonese.
Yeah, different languages.
Asking for,
as
right?
different as Spanish is from Swedish. Yeah, sure.
Right.
I
They
mean,
all
but
came
both are,
from
hey, both are European languages, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even as close as, say, Spanish and Portuguese. They're totally different, completely different. Yeah. And again, when you learn one Chinese language, it doesn't help you speak a different one. But if you learn the written script, it's the same for everybody because it's not phonetic. You see, the symbols do not represent sounds like in our alphabet, they represent ideas. And it doesn't matter what language you speak. If you understand the writing, it's the idea that comes across. So you can have all kinds of different people speaking different languages, reading the same text in Chinese characters because it's ideographic, it's not phonetic. You see,
Right.
and this was what the idiot white missionaries never got. They never understood this, in China or in Hawaii or back in California either. They never quite got it. And so they kept calling all these different languages dialects because once they learned to read Chinese characters, they only learned it in a single language. Okay. And they assumed that everything else was simply a dialect. Okay. Kind of a long answer, but
Right.
Okay. When I used to teach university, we'd go into this every year and belabor this point year after year after year. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brian.
My pleasure. My
We've come to
pleasure.
the end of this first webinar. I just want to make sure that you folks join us for next week, Saturday, the 21st. We're going to make sure that we get all these glitches worked out. There was a lot of people online that couldn't log on, so we
Sure.
appreciate you folks being here.
Sure.
But do me a favor, if you've enjoyed this so far, as soon as this ends, please get on your phone and call all your family and your friends and anybody else you think might be interested in this and get them to register before next Saturday's event. We're going to also make a recording of this available so that all the people that weren't able to view it, and if you want to view it again, you can. Just tell them to go to the ttahawaii.com site. That's ttahawaii.com, and they can register there. And as a reminder, like I said, this and next week's presentations are recorded and they will be made available to all those that are registered.
And,
So anyway,
and
Brian, yeah.
What other thing, anyone that thinks up a question they may come up with in the intervening week, don't hesitate to ask it next week too,
Right.
Be happy
And
to.
you were just getting on the point. Interesting minds think alike, right? So
Of course.
any kind of specific questions that you have for Dr. Dillon, go ahead and send them to us at sungshinhawaii@gmail. And this information will be available at the end of the last slide. I think we're all kind of looking forward to hearing what you have to share for next week. So with that, I want to go ahead and end this by just closing by just saying one more thing. I truly believe that there's a reason why we're sharing this time together today. It's because your understanding of your family's history impacts all of us. And if you're willing to ultimately share this with your own story with others, that's where the impact is going to be. History, it's not just about yesterday. It's about today and what happens tomorrow. We make history. I think Michelle Chong of the Chinese Family History Group expresses it so eloquently on their website. She said that the reason why we need to share our own stories is to educate others of the struggles and obstacles that our ancestors came, and to actually frame this in the context of what was happening in a history often not found in books. But don't leave it to others to tell your story, because your story is our story. Until next week, aloha.